We're thinking today about this topic of Santa versus Jesus. You'd be forgiven, wouldn't you, for thinking that people could get a little bit confused when it comes to Christmas. You get all the kind of stories and the narratives of Christmas all thrown into one. You've got, Rudolph, you've got Santa, you've got the flying snowman, you've got Jesus, you've got the little donkey. The donkey always gets into the story somewhere. And they all kind of get jumbled up into one big Christmas mush. And some people genuinely do get confused. There was a Christmas card that was published in the Far East, and had a picture of Santa Claus being crucified on a cross, which is a little bit of a confusion. And people do get confused. I don't know if you saw that episode of The Simpsons, where Bart says, now at Christmas we really need to remember the true message of Christmas, and that is that Santa Claus was born. We kind of put all these stories together. And actually, for lots of us, maybe for you, we kind of think, well, when it comes to Santa, when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to Rudolph, they're all nice stories, they're all myths, they're all for the Christmas season alone, they're all for children primarily, because it's kids that kind of like them, big kids as well, that sometimes do as well. And actually, whether it's Jesus or Santa, isn't it all really about just getting kids to behave, If you're not good, Santa won't give you any presents, or if you're not good, Jesus, will send you to hell. That's kind of how we kind of think of it. It's all kind of jumbled up into the same thing. So you might be forgiven for thinking, well, it's really just the same stuff, isn't it? And maybe that's your opinion. I heard a story a while back of the perfect man and the perfect woman. Don't know if you heard this one. But it was Christmas Eve and they were driving through town and it was snowing and it was very cold and icy. And at the side of the road they looked over and they saw that there had been an accident, and on closer inspection they realised that the person involved was actually Santa Claus. He had crashed his sledge into the side of the road. Rudolph was mortally injured, and so because they were the perfect man and the perfect woman, they decided to help out. So they put Santa Claus into the back seat, put all the presents into the boot, and started driving around the town, delivering all the presents to the boys and girls. But halfway through the night, there was a terrible accident. They hit some black ice, they spun out of control, and there was such a bad accident that only one of the members of that car survived. Who was it that survived? Any guesses? Well, of course, it was the perfect woman, because everyone knows that there's no such thing as the perfect man or Santa Claus. Which, of course, explains why there was an accident, because the woman was driving. Sorry, that was a really bad joke. Now, half of you aren't going to listen to me for the rest of the talk. But really, it's just to say that actually most of us know, don't we, that Santa Claus doesn't exist. I can say that at a student's event. I get in big trouble saying that in family carol services over Christmas. I've had parents threatening to sue me for making such an assertion in front of their children. But we know Santa Claus doesn't exist, and actually for a lot of people they would say, of course we know that Jesus doesn't exist. A lot of people would say, well, it kind of comes in the same category of myth. And Richard Dawkins says that a good case can be made that Jesus never historically existed. Now actually it's interesting that when you look at the case that is made for the non-existence of Jesus, it's never made by serious historians. There isn't a historian worth his salt that's willing to make that kind of claim. There's just so much evidence. It's interesting that Richard Dawkins, when he wants to make that claim, quotes a retired professor of German, not a retired professor of history, to try and suggest it. See, this man who split history in two, this man who a third of the world's population claims to follow, did exist. There is plenty of historical evidence for him. And actually, if Jesus didn't exist, you have to ask the question, who was it who existed in his place? Who was it who was responsible for the incredible teaching that is still repeated and followed today? Who was it who was responsible for starting the biggest sociological phenomenon in history? Who was it who managed to transform the thinking of strict monotheistic Jews to believe that a man was actually God? If it's not Jesus, then someone else incredible has existed in history that everyone else has forgotten about. You see, actually Jesus did exist. We know that. Now, of course, people say things like this. isn't there more evidence? Why isn't there more evidence? Why isn't there evidence for this person or that person? And of course, in theory, when it comes to any historical study, you can always say, why isn't there more evidence? But actually, one of the questions you need to ask is there enough evidence? And actually, when you start to look at the person of Jesus, you realise the astounding amount of evidence there is, considering how long ago he lived, and considering the lifestyle he had and where he lived as well. Evidence from outside of the Bible, and of course evidence from inside the Bible. So often people dismiss that because it's kind of religious evidence. But actually, I would say that's a mistake. There are two mistakes you can make, by the way, in the Bible. There's a mistake that Christians sometimes make, and that is they accept the Bible without thinking just because it's a religious text. But the mistake that others can make is to reject the Bible without thinking just because it's a religious text. There's actually lots of evidence to suggest it's really reliable. The Gospel accounts, like the ones on your chairs that you might be sitting on by now, are a really good place to start. Not just from a religious point of view to discover about a religious leader, but also from a historical point of view to discover the historical Jesus. He really did exist. But actually, maybe for some of us, maybe for most of us, the issue is not so much whether Jesus existed in history. Most of us probably would accept that such a figure probably did exist. But for some of us, the issue is more, well, what about the stories? The teaching, fine, but all these ridiculous stories, about, virgin birth and all the other stuff, how can you accept those? And actually, when you think about it, some people might suggest there's a bit of similarity here with Santa Claus. You see, there was actually an original Santa Claus, although that wasn't his name. There was a saint called St. Nicholas. He was apparently a bringer of gifts to children at Christmas time. And it's from that historical person, St. Nicholas, that people got the nice kind of supernatural story of this Santa who flies through the sky with Rudolph and everything else. And people say, well, isn't that a bit like Jesus? There was a historical figure, he was a good teacher, and over the centuries, kind of this myth about him being God and doing all this stuff has evolved so that today we've got all of these other stories around Jesus too. Sounds kind of compelling, doesn't it? Until you realise that actually the opposite is in fact the case. See, it wasn't so much that the original followers of Jesus just believed him to be an ordinary man, and it was the later followers that turned him into some divine figure. But actually it was the original followers of Jesus that held him to be God incarnate, God in human form. And for 2,000 years, it's the later people who have been trying to turn Jesus just into an ordinary man. It's the later documents that are always trying to humanise Jesus. It's the original ones that make him out to be the most supernatural. Now, of course, you might say, well, of course, people back then would believe that kind of stuff, wouldn't they? They lived a long time ago, and they didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have. Although I suggest that even though their scientific knowledge may have been more deficient than ours, they still normally knew that dead people stayed dead, and that water didn't become wine, and people couldn't walk on water. Those kind of things don't take a PhD in scientific studies to discover. But I also want to suggest this, that actually the culture in which Jesus was born and lived was a culture in which people were not expecting the kind of things Jesus did. You see, we people today say things like this, how could Jesus be God? How could you expect me to believe that Jesus is God? I'm an intelligent person. I got into Bristol University. I didn't get into UE. I got into I got into a serious university. How could you expect me to believe that kind of stuff? I couldn't say that kind of stuff like that. But actually, there is another culture in history where it was probably equally difficult to believe that Jesus, a human being, was God, and that was the first century culture into which Jesus was born, the Jewish culture of Jesus' day. That for different reasons, but on the same magnitude, would have had the same problem in accepting that kind of claim. And yet, thousands of them in the first generation came to that conviction. You want to ask the question, why? What was it that caused it? Now, of course, there's another thing people sometimes say on this, and that is, well, when it comes to Jesus, we can accept the teaching, but we can't accept the miracles because we now know that miracles can't happen. Okay, we can take everything else, but we can't take the miracles. But think about it, that's a very popular claim to make. How might we know that miracles can't happen? How can we make that kind of claim? The only way we could ascertain absolutely that miracles are impossible is to know that every report of a miracle that's ever been made in history is false. And the only way you can know that every report of a miracle that's ever been made in history is false is if you already know that miracles can't happen. It's kind of a circular argument. Now I grant that maybe from our personal experience, our expectation of miracles to happen are quite low. But what I want to say is this. Don't rule out the possibility just based on your experience or on your presuppositions before you look at the evidence. Which is why we really encourage you to take away this little book that has the name of the author helpfully written on the front, John, which is one of the accounts of Jesus' life. And why not look at the first-hand evidence for yourself over Christmas? And so, well, actually, rather than making up my mind before I look at the evidence, let's look at the evidence and then make up my mind and think about it. Well, that's one big key difference, isn't it, between Santa and Jesus? And maybe that fascinates you, but maybe it doesn't, because you're thinking, well, I'm not really into history, and that's not very interesting. But here's a different one. Have you ever thought about the song, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, okay? You've probably heard it already about 100 times in shops at Christmas. Now that song has been out for quite a few years. Have you ever considered that that song probably couldn't be written today? For instance, laws like data protection. He's making a list, he's checking it twice. And you want to think to yourself, has Santa Claus got permission to have all these kids on his list? Like her parents, given like parental consent for his list? But it gets worse, isn't it? Because he sees when you're sleeping and he knows when you're awake. And you're thinking, what kind of CCTV cameras does Santa Claus have set up around the country? And what kind of pervert is watching all these kids when they're asleep? Like, it's really disturbing, isn't it? And then it says, he knows when you've been good or bad, so be good for goodness sake. And basically the message is this. It's a really helpful message for parents at Christmas time. They say to their son, their daughter, if you're not good, Santa Claus ain't going to give you any presents. And from probably about September onwards, it has a real power to change the behaviour of children up to the age of about 10. And when you become a parent, for those of you who do, then remember that, it's very useful. But again, a lot of people say, well, isn't religion a little bit like that? It's a form of behavioural control. We say there's a God, we say that he's watching you, we say that if you're not good, he'll punish you, and if you are good, he'll reward you. It's a way to make people good. It's a way to control people, isn't it? And sometimes I think maybe religion is like that. And we can form religion, can't we, to try and make people good. But that's where the Christmas story and the Christian story is actually quite radically different. Because actually the Christmas story is not about a God who came to reward the good, but a God who came to rescue the bad. Think about the original story. There were shepherds on a field watching their flocks. Sorry, I always get that one mixed up. And they're there, and the angel comes and says to the shepherds, we bring you good news of great joy, a moral teacher has been born. But that's not what the angel said. We bring you good news of great joy, a great example has been born. That's not what the angel said. They said, we bring you good news of great joy, a saviour has been born. Now, a saviour sounds like a little bit of a religious word, but it really just means a rescuer. Someone who comes in to rescue us out of a situation. And the message of Christmas is that God came into the world not primarily to be a moral teacher, to tell us how to live, not primarily to be a moral example, to show us how to live, although he did teach, and his example is the perfect example. But he came to live the life we could never live, and he came ultimately to die the death we should have died. You see, so many of us just look at the baby and we don't think about his life or his death. And yet all of the Gospels, recording the life of Jesus, spend far more time recounting his death than they do his birth. In fact, John's Gospel, which you've got there, doesn't really talk about his birth at all. It's his death that's really important. Because it's through his death, the claim the Bible makes. It's through his death that actually we can be forgiven. And so the message of Christmas is not a message of karma, this idea of you get what you deserve, like Santa gives you, but a message of grace. A God who gives us what we don't deserve. A God who says, actually, none of us deserve God's forgiveness. None of us deserve God's blessing. None of us deserve to be connected with God. And yet we can have it because of Jesus. We can have it because of his grace. And can I suggest it's a really beautiful thing, and that's totally different to our ideas of Santa, but also our idea of religion. See, think about it. If religion is telling you you get what you deserve, what does that lead to? It's two things, isn't it? Either you're going to end up being really proud, because you're going to go around saying, you know why God accepts me? It's because I'm really good. Because I follow religion, and I follow the rules. And he doesn't accept you because you're not good and you're not as good as me. You become proud, you become morally superior. Or the alternative is you kind of are a bit more honest and you look at your life and you realise that actually you're not as good as you think you are. And you think, well, I'm not good enough, and how could a God who is just and perfect ever accept me? And the answer is, well, could he? So I'm not proud, I'm now depressed. And either way, whether I'm proud or depressed, I'm going to get a pain in the neck to most people, aren't I? That's the problem with this idea of karma, with the idea of religion. But Jesus says, I've come to offer grace. I've come to offer you what you don't deserve. That doesn't lead to pride, because actually Christians don't go around saying, God loves and accepts me because I'm good. Because we're not. But nor does it lead to despair, because we don't go around saying, woe is me, there's no hope, because there is. Because Jesus says, because of what I've done, because of my life, because of my death, because of my resurrection, there is hope for forgiveness and a relationship with God and a future with Him. And that is beautiful, that is wonderful, that's not behavioural control, that's a gift. And that's what Jesus Christ offers. And lastly, before we have some questions, what's the difference between Santa and Jesus? Well, I guess the issue is one of relevance, isn't it? You know, Santa's kind of nice for December, although it kind of annoys me when he comes out in October. Does that ever annoy you? Like, you know, it's like, stay in December, Santa Claus. You're not allowed until October. The weather's still too warm. But like every year it gets earlier and earlier. We like Santa at Christmas. We don't want him intruding into the rest of the year. Because there is no relevance for Santa Claus in the rest of the year. And yet here is the absolute conviction that we have, that actually Jesus Christ is relevant. Not just for Christmas, but for the whole year. Not just for childhood, but for our whole lives. And not just for our whole lives, but also into eternity. Who Jesus Christ is and what Jesus Christ offers is absolutely relevant for the whole of life. It's relevant for our past, because it means there's forgiveness that's available, and we all need it. The past can be wiped clean. It's relevant for our future, because it says that Jesus Christ, the one who was born, is also the one who rose from the dead and conquered death, giving us hope in the future. And in a world filled with death, when 1 out of 1 people will die, that is wonderful news. And it's also great news and relevant for today, because Jesus Christ is the one that can transform our situation today. One of the names given to Jesus was Emmanuel, which literally means God with us. Not just God with them in the past, but the reality of the Christian experience can be God with me right now, because of Jesus, and because of what He's done. So Jesus is relevant, not just for the time when we're drinking mulled wine, but through life, and into death, and through eternity as well. He's absolutely relevant. And so my question, before we go to your questions to you, would be, have you ever experienced the reality of Jesus Christ? Have you ever experienced the reality of His forgiveness and His friendship and what He wants to offer you? I did some research about Christmas the other day, and I discovered something fascinating. Okay, close with this. Did you know that every year, people buy Christmas vouchers, vouchers for people in shops. It's what you do when you can't think of what to buy your sister, which is kind of happening to me every year. So you buy a voucher for H&M or Next or Primark if you're thinking that actually £5 ain't going to go that far. And so you go and buy a voucher. Did you know that every year £250 million worth of vouchers expire in the UK without being used? Like, that's incredible. We basically give £250 million to the retail industry with nothing in return other than a piece of paper and possibly a card. Okay? Like, that's ridiculous, isn't it? People have paid £250 million and people don't experience any benefit from it. Like, you've got it there, and yet it goes in a drawer, you forget about it, you never use it, it's too late. And I think the sad thing at Christmas is actually we can treat Jesus Christ a bit like that. Jesus says, look, I've come to offer you life, I've come to offer you forgiveness, I've come to offer it you, but actually you need to experience and receive that for yourself. It's not automatic, it's something you need to as it were, take the benefit of. It's like a gift. It doesn't need to just be offered, but it needs to be received and unwrapped and experienced. And Jesus says you can experience that too. Our hope this Christmas is not just that you think a little more about Jesus, but actually that you experience the reality that can transform your life as it has done for some of us in a really real way.